Senator Mazza, do you need a calendar?
Or the railroad one?
Yeah.
Maybe one of those. I like the railroad one. Yeah.
All right, well,
Yeah,
we'll get it to
we'll
you.
save you.
We'll get it to you. We'll put it on you.
Yeah,
Former
okay.
Senator Luzzi has graced us with his
Hi,
presence.
Senator Mazza.
Hey, Vince, how are you?
Good. I came to see you yesterday, but you split before I got here.
Oh, gee. How's your son doing? Good?
Good. He got a job in Naples, Florida.
Really? Wow.
Yep. Yep.
What-
He graduated in June and he's got a job, and we'll catch up when I catch you in the building.
Ah, that's great. Good.
Okay.
I'll be back.
Thank you.
Yeah.
2 minutes.
Okay, so we're switching from railroad and aviation budgets and flood resilience to back to our discussion about automatic traffic law enforcement. So we had Mr. Schilling from the ACLU come in to talk about it. And we said this from the other people that were testifying on S-184 as well. We're not really looking at the full S-184 but about what could we do around automated enforcement, if there's any.
Excellent. So for the record, I'm Falco Schilling. I'm the advocacy director for the ACLU of Vermont. We're one of 53 nationwide affiliates of the American Civil Liberties Union, all independent, so across all 50 states, and we represent, a good number of Vermonters, and our goal is to advance the interests of civil rights and civil liberties in the state. Sorry, I'm getting a phone call on all my devices at the same time, which is always very fun. So I'm going to try and silence that quickly. But I really appreciate you inviting me in to testify about S-184 and automated traffic enforcement generally. I think I'm going to try and tailor my remarks to kind of the scope that you were talking about in terms of what would we be concerned about? What would we be considering if we were looking at implementing something like a pilot?
Right.
So I'm not going to spend too much time diving into the bill itself, except for a couple sections where I think there's some good examples of the type of things we'd like to see in place if the state were to move forward with this type of automated traffic enforcement system. So just kind of high level, I want to speak to why the ACLU would care about something like this and why we would have some concerns, but also why we could see some potential benefits from automated traffic enforcement. So when we look at what's happening on our roadways, we do have some concerns in terms of both the level of current enforcement, as well as the disparities we see in roadside stops on our highways. So if you look at some of the studies that have been done, study out of UVM found that Vermont drivers are stopped at about 3 times the rate the national average.
Was that before COVID?
That was the 2015 to 2019 study. And then even during the pandemic, when the stops went down overall, Vermonters generally were being stopped at a higher rate than the national average. So that's something that's of concern to the ACLU when anytime someone is being pulled over by law enforcement, having to sit on the side of the road. That creates safety concerns for everyone, for the officers, for people who are in those cars. Also, depending on who someone is, you can experience that stop very differently. Some people feel very safe and protected by law enforcement. Other people feel very threatened and might have a very different reaction. So that's something that we're thinking about. When you look at a bill like this that would reduce the number of roadside stops, that's something that we could see as beneficial. Another thing that could be beneficial from this type of system is the fact that it removes discretion. When we look at roadside stops and what the data that we have, the study at UVM found that Black drivers were stopped at about 80%, about 80% more often than white drivers, and Latinx drivers were stopped about 26% more often than white drivers. And then after that, we're much more likely to be stopped, likely to be searched, and we're searched at about 3 times the rate, less likely to have contraband. So what that says to me is, in play, there's some level of conscious or unconscious bias, and one of the possible benefits of some sort of automated traffic system would be you're eliminating some of that bias. It's based on what you're seeing in front of you, and from my understanding of the bill, this would be from rear-facing cameras that are not looking at who the driver is, but just looking at the conduct that happens within the defined work zone, or at a red light, potentially as envisioned by this bill. So I think that's high level. Those are some of the things we could see would be beneficial from this type of regime. Concerns we might have echo some of what you've heard from other folks, like the Office of Racial Equity and others in terms of equity. So we've seen from other jurisdictions, depending on where you place these cameras, They could have a disproportionate impact in terms of more fines being generated from communities that are either lower income or more representative communities of color. It can have a disproportionate impact. So I think that's one of the things that Susanna Davis spoke to in terms of thinking about where we might cite these type of things. If we're talking more specifically about interstate highways where there's road construction going on, I think that's less of a concern than if you're targeting things like intersections and stuff like that in more residential neighborhoods where you're going to get a more representative sample of the general public on a interstate highway or something like that. So other things that we are also would be concerned about with some sort of automated traffic enforcement system. In looking at this bill, one thing that jumped out to me is what are the defenses that someone might have if they were to receive a ticket in the mail for something like this. And the first one that jumped out to me is the inability to say that literally wasn't me, I was not driving. And I think there are some other jurisdictions that allow for that sort of defense. So that's something that we'd like to examine more if we were to move forward this. What are those available defenses? I believe Colorado, I think, has some ability to at least attest that it was not you driving, but it does not require you to say, but it was this person. So it doesn't make you, if your spouse, for instance, might be driving a little faster than they should be, you're not required to then turn them over. Do
you know if could they just do that by the mail? Like they just check
I think it's an
box,
attestation.
yeah.
So I think just looking at how someone could could defend themselves by saying, I was not the person doing this conduct. Because I think when we're looking at the fines, one of the ideas is you want to have a deterrent effect as a way to get someone to either curb their behavior or not do it in the first place. And if the person's not driving the car and then just getting the bill, it might not have that same deterrent effect you're looking for. The other thing, when I was looking at the language, I don't know if this is oversight, but the ability, because you can contest the ticket by saying that your vehicle was reported stolen, but it was unclear to me whether you could just say, that's the wrong vehicle, completely wrong vehicle. So this has happened to me where during the pandemic, I got a traffic ticket from the state of Colorado for speeding on the interstate out there, captured with a traffic camera. I had not gone to Colorado. I hadn't really gone beyond, downtown Montpelier a whole lot due to the pandemic. And when I was able to contest that by looking at the picture, I was like, that's not even the number that you said it is. Like, that's not my license plate. You were mistaken. You said this to the wrong person. So being able to contest a ticket in those means, I think, would be important. It's something to look at in the available defenses. And then finally, the other major concern that we would have about something like this would be privacy and security of information. Because obviously the ACLU is concerned if there's going to be a large data collection effort for law enforcement, how that would be used, and the implications on privacy and expectations of privacy on our roadways. Some of the things in this bill that I appreciated was when they had the retention period, the data was not going to be retained beyond the date when it was actually needed. So once this had been used and a ticket had been finally disposed of, that information is called to be the bill calls for it to be deleted. Mm-hmm. So that's something that I think is a good practice to look at in terms of really minimizing the amount of time that data is sitting on a server somewhere where it could be accessed for an unintended purpose beyond what was originally envisioned in this bill, which is literally just to calculate that person's speed, issue a ticket, and then adjudicate it in one way or another through the process laid out. The other thing I appreciated was on page 16, the limitations on the available use of that data. It's very clear that it is limited to the use of this program, is not going to be used for other purposes. And I think putting those explicit limitations on the use of that data is a really good idea, and one that we would like to see in some sort of program or pilot going forward in terms of what protections we put in place for folks who are using our roadways and the information we'd be collecting as a government on them and storing. So I think at a high level, those are some of the thoughts and concerns we have when looking at this bill. Like, you're balancing a lot of interests here. I think that some folks might have anticipated we'd come in and just be like, no, this is something we couldn't really support. But I do think there are some interests at play, both roadside safety, reducing overall stops, because that's a safety concern from a number of different perspectives. we do have the equity concerns, and that's why I appreciate the report back provision in this. I think if we're to institute this type of program, it's very smart to make sure we're understanding how it's working, where it's being implemented, what are those implications. I know there's some limitations in terms of some of the data that might be collected in terms of who the actual drivers are, because that's how this is set up. But understanding what that means for overall enforcement could be helpful. And I guess one other concern that I do just have in terms of what this might mean in terms of the number of violations that were issued and or tickets or is how that might shake out. Does this mean we're just going to be seeing more enforcement on the roadways? That would be a concern of ours, but especially when we're looking at a program that would largely be self-funded. I think that's the testimony I heard, and if I'm incorrect in that, the revenue from this program would be used to help support the ongoing operation of that. And so if that's basically additional revenue being collected through the use of this enforcement, through further enforcement on our roadways, when we're already seeing a high number of roadside stops, that could be a concern.
I don't remember that.
I might have.
Well, they
I
said
know that we're gonna hope to get a federal match, that's why there's an assessment.
federal money to get it going, because there's a big expense to get it going, but then they said in the future that the hope would be that the revenue, because the federal money
The
goes
operational.
to get it going.
So I think just, general concern, that's something that we would think about when looking at this type of program. Is this a way to generate, more revenue from folks, in a very broad-based way to help support these programs? Though we of course support the safety concerns of folks, and especially wanting to promote safety on our roadways. So I guess at a high level, those are our thoughts on this legislation, and I'm happy to talk more about it. But I really appreciate you taking this up. I appreciate the thought you also gave to the secondary stops bill and the work that the Senate has done on that. I know that's over in judiciary right now, but I appreciate you all thinking about that, the work that you have done around things like secondary enforcement of seatbelts, and
We have been adamant about that.
it's something we also
The other
agree
body
with.
has been very persistent, we have been equally persistent for the very reasons. And I think it was the state of Florida ACLU data that was so persuasive. But one of the original presentation we had was to allow, we're doing a pilot, but was municipalities would be able to do this. And I would think that would perhaps precipitate the concerns around neighborhoods and the extent to which a municipality might, cite the camera in a neighborhood that's predominantly poor or predominantly minority or whatever. So there's a certain neutrality on whoever's using the interstate and going through the work zone it's kind of a neutral site that you don't have. Yeah, go ahead.
Cut you off.
No, I was just thinking about the testimony here relative to municipalities and really, if that extended, how you avoid these very concerns that we've heard from Susanna Davis as well.
A concern that's been raised by Judge Zone was echoed by V-Trans was that there would be disparity if this were to be in place, that if you get caught with a camera, it's going to be more like a parking ticket and that's small with no points. Whereas if a police officer pulls you over for the same infraction, unless we change the laws, but it would carry a driver's license points. And otherwise, I still think the merits are there to move towards more of this, that we're not pulling people over. But I'm curious if you have a response or reaction to disparity in the same violation resulting in different consequences, be it a camera versus a police officer that observes and cites it.
Well, I think when we are looking at instituting systems that don't have that same level of discretion and how this would be implemented, I think it makes sense to have these be lower level fines, especially with some of the concerns that we raised about notice. These are going to go to people in the mail, and if they don't respond, then there's a judgment entered against them. There's a whole different notice component when an officer pulls you over. So this could be casting a much wider net for folks. And I think that inadvertently folks might get pulled into it who are not doing the activity that we're trying to regulate, right? They weren't the ones speeding, but they could be getting the ticket. And so I think that's a reason to look at some of the disparities. They're not necessarily the person doing it.
don't see that. The camera picks a car going up so fast and then I don't see that argument working and the way you said. I mean, how can there be a disparity? You've got a vehicle speeding through a work zone and it catches it on camera and you send a ticket to them. I don't see a disparity there.
I think what I was speaking to is the fact that the person who receives that ticket might not have been the driver in that situation. That's where there's a difference in how this might be treated, because you're going to catch a wider net of like, there are more likely to be folks who did not actually engage in the conduct who are then being asked to pay a fine.
And we had that a bit, Judge Sunday, because it's the car, and what if the car is owned by, a husband and wife, for example, who gets the ticket, who pays, who's, so, and the car obviously doesn't pay.
Right.
So that was one of the issues that was brought up. But I guess if I understood what you were saying, the camera is very neutral and it doesn't make a judgment. You either, you hit that standard or not, whatever that tolerance is. When an officer pulls you over, when we heard some testimony, oftentimes they don't give you a ticket. They might give you a warning. They use exercise judgment, which a camera doesn't do. So I just want to make sure I understood the point that you were making, is that there is a distinction that can be made between when you're talking directly with the operator of the vehicle and you can make a judgment around the circumstances.
Yeah, I think you captured my comments correctly. And then the additional element I would add is, who is driving the car.
Well, that's true. Yeah.
And I think that's probably the biggest
That's what I
distinction.
meant by you're seeing the driver.
Right, you're seeing the driver, the law enforcement officer is dealing with that and knows who actually did the violation. Whereas if you're just taking the car, it's less likely to actually be fully targeted person who's a driver.
Could be
And
your teenage
Yeah, that's what I'm worried
child.
about.
right,
Mhm.
yeah,
If
and I
it's a
know
license tomorrow.
Susanna also talked about the idea of, and there's a number of one-car families out there where this could have a big impact. And yeah, it might not be you who's driving, could be a spouse, could be a child. But I think that's a justifiable reason to look at having a lower level penalty for something like this that's caught on a traffic camera of some sort.
You're not worried, the ACLU isn't worried about this like unequal treatment. Somebody gets $200 and 2 points and the other person gets $25. Like,
I think, well, I will say that sometimes we are generally worried about how discretion can play out on the roadways, where sometimes that officer discretion, depending on who that person is, depending on if they have personal history, who knows what, or for whatever reason, people who are pulled over by law enforcement can face really different consequences from that stop. Whereas this is at least a more uniform way of dealing with these infractions. And so uniformity is something we're always looking for in our criminal legal system. And so this is a step in that direction, though it has, a number of the concerns that we laid out in terms of how it's implemented. I think that's a place where we would err more on the side of wanting to see more consistency.
Senator Eagleson.
I do. I just want to go back to the comment I'd made, a question I asked Suzanne, and I just like get your take on it. You got a predominantly black neighborhood. It's got a high rate of people walking on sidewalks and kids going to school. And we have a work project in there, and they set this camera up in there. Is that it? And I guess the way that the question was answered with Suzanne, I took it that. And what I'm most worried about is that people of color have less protections that the rest of the state of Vermont has. Would you be bothered, or is that bothersome to the ACLU that we would have a work zone in there and that we were wanting to protect those people on the sidewalks going to school in the same way that we would in a predominantly white neighborhood?
I think our concern is we'd want to see some strong and neutral criteria that could be used in terms of site selection in the first place. I think this is what you were speaking to, Senator, in terms of when municipalities might be setting up these type of systems, making sure that we're prescriptive in the reasons we want to have them in those areas. What are the factors that should be considered before installing something like that? And if those are, neutral criteria that we're using and applying generally, that's much less of a concern. The concern would be if there's not a whole lot of criteria around it, we're just kind of doing this based off feelings or where we think this should be, things like that. That's where more bias can come into play. So I think strong neutral criteria at the outset for site selection is a way to get at that. And it might be in that neighborhood you're describing, it might be a different neighborhood, but we want to make sure the reason it's there is because of, neutral reasons that are
Well,
for
work
traffic
zones
safety.
Usually are fairly neutral.
Yeah.
If you believe that everybody should have the same access to, be able to be safe, and it shouldn't matter of what
100%.
area or what neighborhood it is or anything like that, that everybody equally throughout the state should have the same opportunity to be safe.
100%.
So I have a question on, are you familiar with the Soldiers and Sailors Act as we're rolling around tickets?
I am not, I first heard of this when, in some of the testimony last week, so I have not dug deeply into that and the implications that might arise from implementing this type of enforcement. So not super familiar, but now I'm aware of it.
Yeah, I just didn't know if basically in these other states where it's happening, if, somebody said, hey, look, I'm a soldier, I have this right, and they sent me a ticket, but I was on base or, deployed overseas. I didn't know how if the ACLU had ever looked at that as.
I mean, I think generally, as we were talking about before, having ways for folks to contest that, if it's done in error, I think that's worth it. But also there could be a possible exemption. So I need to look more at the law, but I think that's something worth looking at, and I think there's a way to figure out.
Other states must have dealt with it. Judge Zone also made reference to that.
Right, I've heard it from several, and also
I hadn't heard of it until
I had not heard
a
of
couple
it.
weeks ago.
right, it's on I guess if I ever
Right
got a
up there
ticket,
with
I never
NIST.
looked on my ticket that there was a box to check.
Oh,
But, yeah, I assume other states have done it, and maybe if there isn't any penalty because if they're stationed overseas, they might not even be opening their mail or,
Right.
have a long delay, so it gets to this main issue at least that I'm struggling with, is how you do the enforcement and how you do how you set up the defense or what the legal remedy is for those people that get it in the mail.
Yeah, I think that is the crux of the issue, and as you continue to work on this, we're happy to continue to weigh in. But
Yeah, and one favor I could ask,
yeah,
is to check in with ACLUs in the other states and just say, like, have they, is there good practices, how have they dealt with these other issues,
yeah, happy to do that.
Okay.
I would just think, I don't think we're blazing a trail here. I mean, the
No.
parking tickets have these same problems and all the other states are using this technology. So I'd welcome any guidance from other ACLU efforts in other states.
Right, and it's like this question of, do you have an officer involved or not have an officer involved, and these kind of things. Okay, well, thank you. Any other questions for Mr. Schilling?
Just wonder if you're gonna look at it, for us as, the vice chair has asked. The question that was asked earlier is, because there's two different ticket systems and two different fine systems, how that would play out. I mean, I can't imagine that there aren't lawsuits out there, or there couldn't be lawsuits out there that, hey, my buddy just got picked up and his $200 fine, and now it's only $25 fine, same speed, same everything, and I don't know, I can't imagine that there's not lawsuits for that.
I don't know of any at this point in time, but I'm happy to look into that a little bit more. I think there's questions of notice. That's at least definitely envisioned in this bill, is very clear notice to folks when these types of things are going to be in place, what the penalties and fines might be. Folks have
sort of like proceed at your own risk. If you're
And-
giving them, that kind of notice, the speed camera ahead.
Yeah, I'd be happy to look into that more and see if, any colleagues around the country
Well, it's
face
almost the same
concerns.
though as what I raised before, is that you have almost the same notice or of fines doubled, in a work zone. I mean, so you have that proceed at your own risk or offend at your own risk.
Well, except for work zone, you're getting immediate notice. You don't know if there's a trooper at the next pull-off. I mean, so you don't have the same kind of alert that you're getting here. The whole purpose is people are working there and they're vulnerable and they need to be protected. So I think, gee, if you're a driver and you're already told there's a camera ahead, chances are you should register that you're putting yourself at risk if you don't obey the rules of the road. So I see it somewhat differently than a random traffic stop because, somebody happened to be at that pull off, north of.
Especially because we know
St.
that the sheriffs or the law enforcement on the site isn't really allowed to stop anybody, so once you kind of learn that.
Yeah,
I see almost the same thing though, that you're advertising that there's a traffic camera ahead or fines are doubled and they're speeding in the work zone. I mean, you're taking that risk of doing the same thing. One is probably a certain thing that there's camera there, and one is at least you're being warned that your fine's gonna be doubled if you're caught speeding in there. There may or may not be a trooper there.
so you're talking about the disparity of that work zone as opposed to just a
Exactly.
general stop.
Exactly.
I think that's why the data that we heard, why they work so well, is because they know everybody's gonna get the picture taken where they like, well, I know that sheriff is there, not gonna pull me over, and the chance of a police car being in the
But
work.
the camera's there 24/7.
Right. Especially once people start getting in mail, they're like my son got a ticket in the mail from New York. And he was like, oh, I didn't know they had cameras. He didn't say, oh, I should slow down. He said, oh, I didn't know they had cameras. But I think now he's gonna slow down because he had to pay the ticket.
If I may, as somebody who I will admit on the record, I have a lead foot. I often like to speed, but I also know that I always have my phone up with Waze, and it alerts me when there's a police officer or a speed camera, and I slow down in order to avoid tickets. So part of why I support this technology is because I think it will also drive better, safer behavior, as it does for me when I'm in New York City or when I'm going through a work zone. Yes, I shouldn't speed.
It's hard
but
to
if
speed in New York City.
This was on the
There was
throughway.
times I wanna like blast through that intersection with that camera on the alert on Waze. I'm not gonna do that.
Well, I'm just.
Just admitting my actual driving behavior.
Law
Better man
enforcement,
than I.
law enforcement has been warned. Okay, thank you, Michelle.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. This is my
Yeah.
first time in this committee, so I
Well, glad
really
you
appreciate
came
it.
in.
And if you find any other information out there,
I would circle back.
Thank you.
So we're on tender limits again?
Well, it's a committee discussion, and that means is
For the 3 documents for tomorrow.
at home,
I
hopefully.
had a kid with a fever.
The fever is doing well. So we basically need to wrap up the miscellaneous C&D. We have all the sections that were agreed on. It seems like we agreed on that the muffler stamp thing was not ready for prime time. We're gonna wait for the great noise study that is gonna come out next
Great
year.
noise, a great awakening.
It's gonna be great. We're gonna have also some new legislation.
What'd you
that's
say,
gonna come out of that.
Donald? It's gonna be great.
It's gonna be great. Okay, and then, well, we still have the signal lights, which I think we just haven't gone over. I think there's agreement on the committee about that, but we just haven't gone over the language. And then there's a question of, do we want to proceed with changing the regulations around tinted windows, or do we not? And I think we're maybe of a mixed mind in that, so I don't know, we could have Anthea take us through the signal lights, but do people need more information about the tinted windows? Do they want to see the language? How are people feeling about proceeding on that?
They're still a little lost at where we're even at with it, so if we can just go through it, I guess.
Okay, yeah, Anthea can take us through that. Does that sound good?
Yeah,
Okay.
that works for me. And thank you for being accommodating. I'm actually now home with 2 sick kids, so hopefully they will nap and continue eating lunch for the next half hour. I will share the language so that you all have it. There are 3 documents that are posted under my name for today's date, and I think it makes sense to start with the one that looks like a draft strike all amendment. That is going to be the language that shows the change for the signal lamps. I have it up. If you are jumping to the pertinent page, you're going to start on page 12, which is what I have open. The changes for the signal lamp languages are in sections 14 to 19. So the first piece you're going to see, this is at the bottom of page 12, and this is where you've got the prohibition, subsection A, starting at line 8, adding a new prohibition to just be very explicit that a lamp or lamps that is not an emergency warning lamp and provides a flashing light in a color other than amber is prohibited. So you've got 4 things that are prohibited. A motor vehicle shall not be operated upon a highway of the state equipped with any of the following: the siren, unless a permit has been issued or it doesn't need a permit, and that's going to be for your government-owned law enforcement vehicles and your government-owned emergency services vehicles. An emergency warning lamp, those are going to be the flashing red lights, the flashing blue lights, the flashing red and amber lights, and the flashing blue and amber lights. You cannot have those unless a permit has been issued for that. That's going to be for your non-government owned emergency services vehicles or your non-government owned law enforcement vehicles, or you're allowed to have one just because you are a government owned emergency services vehicle or law enforcement vehicle. That's subdivision 2. A blue light of any kind, unless you have a permit or you are not required to have a permit. Those are the same allowances as for the other lights. This is to get at like the very dark or the very vibrant blue fog lights or the blue undercarriage lights. So no blue lights unless you are government-owned law enforcement, government-owned emergency services, or you have a permit. And then the new one is the flashing lights of any color other than amber. So that's going to be getting at green lights on snowplows you wouldn't be allowed to have, purple lights on funeral vehicles wouldn't be allowed to have. I'll pause there if there are questions, because that's one of the 2 changes in the language.
They would be allowed, but they just couldn't be flashing.
Yes, they could have a color, they could have a green undercarriage light, a purple undercarriage light. It just wouldn't be allowed to be a flashing one.
I want to go back to the blue light.
Okay.
Many headlights are very blue, but they're not the intensity that you were describing. So are we in fact having a very, very significant impact on headlights that might be that bluish tinge, but aren't the deep blue that you have with law enforcement?
Well, we're not, this is, the law enforcement officer would have to decide what the color is. So you wouldn't want colorblind law officer making the ticket, but I think some of them are blue, but then I look at it and I'm like, is that blue like the headlights?
Some just get your attention, right? Like last night I got off the interstate, I come back across the top of the interstate, and something caught my eye and I looked, and it was somebody coming with a tint of blue, but then once I saw it, it was like, oh no, it's not blue, but it did catch your eye.
Right,
And
it
it made
sounds
you
like
look.
a very light blue, so I don't know if those are aftermarket or if those are, I think they're,
I think
manufacturers.
Audi might even have them done.
yeah, so I don't,
Come with-
I think we don't want to get into the argument or the discussion of how we define blue.
No, but it's at the blue light of any
I
kind.
love talking lights.
Yeah, like, we could make it write a definition of what is blue, but I would rather that we didn't.
So I have 2 things to add here. One, you cannot regulate headlights as a state. There is federal language that would preempt state regulations of that for what's required for auto manufacturers. And then the second thing I would suggest is if you think that this might inadvertently be hindering what lights auto manufacturers would be able to have, maybe asking the Alliance if those lights actually are blue or if they just appear blue, if law enforcement would interpret that. Could be a question that you ask law enforcement. Sergeant Howard has been involved in working on this language, and he did not raise the is that fog light actually blue or not actually blue concern. But those are the 2 people that I would suggest reaching out to, or 2 entities, law enforcement and the car manufacturers.
I'm sorry, I'm just thinking about it as I'm looking at,
Yeah.
in terms of, gradation, so to speak. Because I've been thinking of those very deep blue ones that you said are almost the equivalent of, of police.
You could put in something that says, a blue light unless of any kind, unless either a permit, et cetera, or it was part of the vehicle as manufactured. And then you would be getting at the idea of like the aftermarket inclusion.
I think it's fine the way it is, I mean, because that's just, we are already preempted by the federal law, so if it came up, that's what would happen. I don't think we need those.
No, it seems like it's redundant.
I can check with the Alliance and see if they want, and or raise anything or testify about headlights or any other like manufactured lights that might get caught up in this.
It's just a thought.
Yeah,
Do we have any deadline on this, or is this just crossover now?
it basically is just crossover at this point, yeah. I guess the only other deadline would be we'd want to get it to the House or when they finish the big bill, so they have something to do, keep idle hands. Okay, so are we okay with this blue light?
I'm okay with, I mean, as long as the committee, I'm okay with that.
And knowing, the federal preemption, I think helps
Did
too.
DMV look at it too and gave you the thumbs up? Yeah, okay. Yeah, well, state police and DMV looked at it. Okay, so where are we with the window tinting?
Oh, wait, we still have one more piece with emergency warning lamps. So the
Okay.
other thing that you're going to see is just some technical changes that I did to use the same phrasing throughout. Since this is now broader in terms of the ones that do not need permits, I added emergency services to line 16. Where you're getting the substantive change is all of the language that would allow emergency services vehicles that are owned and operated by the government would not need a permit on those vehicles if there are sirens and a red emergency signal lamps or red and white emergency warning lamps. And then you've got a blue emergency warning lamp that they could have. That would be the single one mounted so as to be visible primarily from the rear of the vehicle. And then subdivision 2 would be your emergency services vehicles that are not owned and operated by the government. And those are the ones that would need to continue getting the permit. And the rest of the changes are just going to be technical.
So this was, I had a thought though on the timeline. Another reason to maybe move it a little quicker is because Anthea would be able to explain this to the House while she's still here, which might be helpful, having a new person.
I will write a detailed section by section summary, and that can go to the other body as well.
We probably, yeah, it'll be interesting who's gonna lead us through the houses, the T-bill. Okay. Okay, so I think we can close out the light section.
Okay, great.
With the
So
caveat,
then,
I'll check with the Alliance and see.
okay, so that's going to take you to your side proposals. It sounds like section 13A and section 13AA, that's the muffler stamps, putting a pin in for now. You're going to wait to see what comes from the noise report, which is then going to take you to your tinted window language. This is going to start with section 13B at the bottom of page 2. So some of the changes since the last time you saw the language was trying to add just a little bit more structure to it, a little bit more clarity. So using subsection headings. So subsection A, this is going to be the section that gives the prohibition. You cannot have material that is obstructing the view on or hung in back of any transparent part of the motor vehicle windshield, vent windows, side windows, etc. Nothing is changing there. The prohibition of this section on hanging items shall apply to shading or tinting material or when hanging an item materially obstructs the driver's view. So this is getting at shading or tinting material that is within the glass. So if you looked at the periodic inspection manual and you have heard testimony about how it's the aftermarket tint that's going to be the fail criteria, whereas if it's within the glass itself, the manufacturer installed tint, that is not something that would be covered by the periodic inspection manual because your statutes themselves do not regulate that tinting material, which makes sense because there are the federal regulations that say it has to be that 70% transmission level, which the manufacturers are complying with, but it doesn't cover if someone were to get not an aftermarket hanging of the windows, but they were going to get replacement windows, for example, that had the tinting material within it. So this would be expanding it to cover that as well. Subsection B, these are your general exemptions. These are things that would not be subject to the prohibition on having tinting material or anything hung that obstructs the view. The new one that you're going to see here is additional item 7. If the object is shading or tinting material, so that could be aftermarket or within the glass itself, and the visible light transmission of that shading, and there's going to be a definition for visible light transmission towards the end of the section, is not less than the level of visible light transmission required under 49 CFR as amended. So that is the 70% threshold at present. Subsection C will continue to be the medical exemption. This is the piece that requires the doctor's note, and then you're allowed to have darker tint. Nothing is changing there. The only thing that's changing is the end sentence, which talks about how if the material has started to tear or bubble, it needs to be removed. That has been put in its own new subsection because it's going to apply to all tinting, not just the medically allowed tinting. Subsection D, no change here, just adding a subsection heading. Subsection E, this is now the removal section that talks about how it needs to be removed if it is tearing or bubbling. That would cover all of the tinted material that was added, the adherence. And then subsection F is going to be your definition. It's defining visible light transmission, and it means the amount of visible light that can pass through shading, tinting, or glazing material that is applied to or within, so on the outside of or within the glass itself, of the transparent portion of a window or windshield of a motor vehicle. And then if you remember, the like percentages are sort of flipped. So if you have nothing, that's going to be 100% visible light transmission. If it's completely blacked out, that's going to be 0% visible light transmission. So the federal requirement that it be a 70% visible light transmission, do like your 100 minus 70, that's like a 30% tint level. So the numbers seem in reverse, but you're describing how much light can come through, not how much tinting is up.
And we don't get into how the DMV would, other than the part on outreach.
So they're required to include it in the periodic inspection manual, and the amendments to the periodic inspection manual need to include what level of visible light transmission is required to meet the federal standards, so the 70% amount as of the effective date of the amendments, and it requires outreach of the same thing. So the pieces that come after changing the law are Section 13C, your legislative intent that this is a safety issue and it should yield failing the periodic inspection. Subsection D, Section 13D, subsection A is saying you need to do your updated rulemaking, and you can have a conversation about whether you want to include that or when it needs to happen by. And then subsection B is going to be your outreach requirement.
So this would force the rulemaking process we were talking about previously.
Yes. If you chose to include Section 13D, subsection A, yes, it would force the update to the periodic inspection manual.
And then I think there, I'm agnostic about how much time. I think we talked about doing a long time of allowing, a big kind of rollout of this. Because also we want to talk to the tinting companies and making sure everybody understands this. There would also have to be something about how the inspection stations will decide whether it's 70%. There's nothing in the statute about that. That would be up to DMV just to do on their own.
I think it would be a DMV in consultation with whatever their software is for AVIP as they program. Because you've got like the paper periodic inspection manual, but there's also like the programmatic piece that comes with making it actually be something that the inspection stations are applying.
There's no need for us to put any of that in the statute.
I think if you were, you would need, I would need a lot more information as to what would need to be included. And I think this is where you're getting at like the point of rulemaking. You, the General Assembly, the legislators, the lawmaking branch of government are saying this is what the law should be, but you are leaving to the subject matter experts, the actual people who work at the DMV that understand how the inspection process works and would know what technology would be necessary to be used there. The other thing you don't have here is you don't have what law enforcement would be doing. And I think that would then be a question for law enforcement. If in their desire to enforce or not enforce this, are they going to need to have some sort of device that can measure the transmission of light through glass?
So as it stands right now, if we were to agree to this, any car that had 70% more than, or anything that had more than 30% tinting would be illegal. And
on the the front side windows and the windshield and the rear windshield, the rear side windows could have any amount of tinting because that's not something that's regulated on a federal level. That's why you see at present cars that come from the manufacturer that have dark windows in the back, but not the front.
But we don't have anything for law enforcement, is if they were to stop one of these cars, what they could do.
Right, which is the situation now. It's illegal now to have any
Yeah,
tint,
yes.
even 2%. But it doesn't fail inspection. So that right now the officer just says like, is there any tinting? And then they could write a ticket for the tinting. It's up to their discretion.
So as of now, then, we are saying that the car can't pass inspection.
If this was to pass, then it would change it from an advisory to fail.
And we don't have any, sorry, Tom, we don't have anything in there right now as far as effective dates of what we're saying that this is going to go.
I have as a placeholder July 1, 2025, but you can certainly change that. It is just a placeholder date to look different than the other effective dates.
I would just say one thing. I'm not against this language, but I don't have any constituents in my inbox about too dark windows. I do have multiple stories over the last 3 years about rotor rust.
Mm-hmm.
And those are very valid arguments that my support for this has not been conditional, but has been as part of a bundle for the process that this would entail with the DMV. I guess my question, since Mike's in the room, does the DMV support this language opening up the inspection manual process that has been previously described?
The one failed, an addition of this one failed condition.
Well, I mean, clearly, if it's in the bill and we're gonna do it, correct? You know, I often wonder about. I've always been told that statute trumps rule. So the problem with the rule is that the rule is the manual, right? So it's not as simple as just saying the statute overrides that. Okay, so I mean, this one could be, I'm assuming, done in the bulletin form, right? Advising the inspection stations that here's the new rule because the statute technically trumps it.
So if you think back to 2018, when the statute was changed to say only safety issues are now going to be a fail criteria, and that triggered the rewrite of the inspection manual, there was a bulletin that went out from the DMV that talked about like the tire pressure sensors, how that was no longer going to be a fail criteria because your tire pressure sensor is a sensor that's trying to tell you like if your tire has enough air, and that was done as like an administrative bulletin. So yes, what Deputy Commissioner Smith said is totally correct. Statute will trump rule. The rule is the periodic inspection manual. You would then be in this sort of weird place where you have an administrative bulletin that's describing what the statute is, and that is sort of part of and substituting for the rule itself. But that is the sort of thing that leads to sort of murky ambiguity, and you would want the rule to be brought to match statute. By having a long sort of implementation range, a year, 2 years, whatever, you could sort of avoid having the administrative bulletin piece because you would not have the statute, the change in the tint statute, take effect until the effective date that's in the future. That would also give people time to remove aftermarket tint that was not of the allowed amount.
Quick follow-up comments. So my concern is if the voters let me come back next year, I'm gonna still support changing the rotor rust thing. And so if we go through this with the tinting, I'm gonna say to the DMV, well, I think we should still go through it again to address the language that I don't think is well worded in our inspection.
You don't think the clarification memo that we talked about?
I don't think it will do what needs to be done. I think we need to change the manual to have more clear language, also allowing the inspector to interpret whether or not it's a safety impact. So I support both of these together because that would lump the process. And then you would go through both of these at the same time. But that's where I am.
Go ahead, Anthea.
Oh, I was just going to say, so you could be creating a situation where if they have to update the periodic inspection manual through rulemaking, whether you tell them to or not, they might update the brake rotor language if they agree that there might be space for clarification in the same vein as whatever is in that clarifying administrative bulletin. They, the DMV, could rewrite the periodic inspection manual tomorrow without the General Assembly telling them to. They have that rulemaking authority. So you do not need to tell them, go update your periodic inspection manual. They could do that themselves, and they might choose to do that on their own.
And I thought we were gonna also talk about the rotor language. That was one of the things that we should put in the.
Do you want to see the replacement rotor language proposal?
Not right now.
Okay.
So let's try to finish this first.
So I heard the testimony as far as on the tinted windows, and I agree with some of the testimony. I just don't see the public outrage over tinted windows enough for me to support it. I just don't see it. If it was part of a larger package and there was a date certain that would give everybody time to adjust, and whether it be 3 years or whatever, and we're not putting another business out of business, we're not unfairly targeting people of poorer means, that buying a car of any whether they can buy and they just happen to have windows and they can't even afford to inspect the car, never mind remove the tint. I guess, if we gave them time, I could get behind it. But as far as to forge ahead with this as a standalone rule, I'm not safe with it.
I'd also just say that if we did include the tinting and the rotor rust, the house is still gonna do what they're gonna do. So I feel like this is early enough in the process that this could be considered over there. So I do support the tinting, and I would just say I'd love to have the rotor rust be part of that same process with clarity. And then let's see what the house can do.
Right, we could make enough time to incorporate all the changes that are gonna come from the noise study. And then, so like, maybe something happens there, so like, say like, we could just more of like state of our intent, but we want changes to tinting and rotors and other things, but we're not gonna make them change it right away just for this, because I do have some constituents that care about this, but it's true, it's nowhere near the kind of level of the rotors as far as concerned.
And I think probably tinting, I'm not hearing it either, but if you're in a more urbanized area and neighborhoods where people, where you've got pedestrians and where you have cyclists more than, we might have in the more rural areas, I think that the safety issues and the visual connection between the vulnerable individual and the driver would probably be more apparent, like, for example, in Burlington or in some of the Montpelier area, whatever, not so much.
And I thought the testimony from the state police was convincing about just safety officer or the safety officer that are approaching these vehicles. And right now, the tinting shops have a sign, or they tell the customers like, this is illegal, but they're doing this. So do we want to kind of encourage, even though it's illegal, by not having it as part of the inspection? Are we gonna have more of it, which is a safety issue both for officers and also just for target identification, as they talked about as you're going through an intersection? So I would like to have us move in this direction, but I hear the arguments about changing the rule again. And actually how we would do it, what's the monitor that you're gonna use and require the inspection stations to have and all that kind of stuff. So that's kind of where I am on it.
So you could say that this was all effective on July 1 of 2026. That gives you time to hear the noise study, which I think you're getting back in January of 2025. And it would also give time to see if the administrative bulletin for brake rotor language, if you went in that direction, made a change. And then you're back for a legislative session before July 1 of 2026, thinking about the fact that it takes like a year to do rulemaking. So you could do something with brake rotor next year that could go into that same rulemaking update.
Yeah. And that also gives folks kind of time to say, hey, this is a problematic, and as you said, Senator Chittenden, the House will look at it and you can have a conversation with them, but then also as DMV looks at it more, sees like they can come back next year and say, we started looking at it because we heard this was your interest, but X, Y, and Z, or here's changes that we can make. Because I don't want to give them another study to say study the language, but just say like this is going to go into effect, so prepare yourself. And your suggestion was July of 26?
I just threw that out because it gives you another full legislative session and then a year to do rulemaking. If you think about the fact that like at its absolute fastest and assuming there are like no public comments that need to be responded to and everything is done just with the amount of time that's required under the APA, you're looking at like 100 days from when the post ICAR filing, so the initial proposed rule is filed with the Secretary of State's office. The adopting agency has 8 months from then to finish rulemaking. So I think saying it's going to take a year from the adjournment of the 2025 session until July 1 of 2026 is very realistic. And I don't know if the DMV would agree with me on that, but I think just looking at the math, saying a year for rulemaking is not out of the ordinary.
Right. I think that's fair and makes sense and isn't just a random number like does it? We can back it up.
And sufficient clarity around legislative intent, which is really key.
Right. And then the other issue, Anthea shared with me or sent me a link at one point of a table from all the other states, and Vermont's law is very different than almost every other state. A lot of states have rules on window tinting. And we were, I think, one of only 2 that I saw in there where it's no tinting.
Yeah, it's like New York. No, not New York. It's New Hampshire, New Jersey, and Vermont, I think, are the only ones that like prohibit any tinting. So like if you're putting tinting on your rear windows, like that's not allowed, but then doesn't have any other requirements there. So it was sort of an outlier in both directions.
And then we have this federal rule. So you buy a new car, you can get 30%, but if you have an old car, you can't
Have anything.
So I thought clarifying that would help the tin shops in a way. They're like, yeah, here's the legal limit, 30%. That could help clarify it. And then you don't get in the situation where they get a ticket and they're like, wow, why did I pass inspection? Or why did the tin shop put this on here?
So this is fair for people that have cars without tinting but want tinting. They should be able to go up to it.
Right. It seems weird to say only those that are buying newer cars or something. Okay. Well, we failed to finish the miscellaneous DMV bill.
Well, so I think you have me in tomorrow. Can I just point out one thing so you know where to look for something and you can look at it between now and tomorrow?
Yeah.
Okay. If you want to see the proposal for the brake rotor language that is not changing the periodic inspection manual, but requiring the administrative bulletin, that is what is highlighted at the bottom of page 7 into page 8 as section 13E. So this is what has been written between yesterday and today. The DMV has looked at it. I don't know if they would propose wordsmithing, but this is sort of moving the idea from yesterday forward so you can see what it looks like in text.
One thing that I wondered if, I don't see it in here, but I looked at it pretty quickly, was the suggestion, which I think was from Bob Church, which Senator Shinda has brought up a couple times, is having the phone number to call if you have questions or complaints.
On the fail form?
On the fail form.
That is not included here, but I can add it if you want to.
You add it, we can look at that when we come in and talk tomorrow. So the goal was tomorrow when Anthea comes in, we could talk about that. I'll see if the Alliance has anything to say, then we might be able to vote it out.
Do we require that for other fail? Are we asking something of inspection stations? If we add that to the form, are they having to do that for other?
It would be for any fail, wouldn't only be for failing for the
Do they have
rotor.
to do that now for the?
No, it's not on the form. They would just have to think about going to the website to find the number to call.
It seems like there's two
There's
separate
two things. One is the number to call and the other is to
Yes.
identify why you failed.
Correct, so.
That's what
The
I'm.
number to call seems like the easiest thing, poster, put on the wall, there it is. And I know we list advisory stuff on the inspection, I haven't failed one, so I don't really know what's printed there, so I'm not useful there, but if we don't already print something and then you wanted everything printed for every fail criteria, I think that would be a monumental task, but I say that only, and I don't know what's on there, and I do apologize for that, I can find out if we print everything. If we do, then adding one more thing doesn't seem like a big deal, right?
Yeah, and I don't, well, I guess I haven't seen one in a long time, because I think when I failed, the mechanic just said, well, you failed, because like I failed with the air temp, the air pressure, when that was a fail. I remember failing for that, and they just said, you gotta get that thing fixed. They didn't show me out the form, they just told me, but maybe we need to see the form. I wasn't thinking we would change what was printed on the reasons. It was just saying, if you have complaint or question,
That's
I don't know the exact language we want to say, but something about if you have concerns or questions about this fail, here's the number to call on the form. If they're handed the form, like you failed, which I assume is what happens, then they have it right there.
I see what you're saying. Have the system printed out, so if you're getting inspected of all failures, you get all failures. District inspector number, first.
Whatever.
the entire state.
Well, yeah, I don't know if it all goes
numbers
to,
by region?
Yeah.
Oh, so you have to, it's not a central number you call.
I just thought we put Captain Davidson's name on
Or
there.
direction to the website.
Oh, Russell, yeah, the direction of the website.
Yeah.
Direction to the
Right, it
website.
could be a website or, yeah, because the numbers are gonna change.
Right,
Or Russ Engel's phone number.
yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
because I thought what Captain Davidson's testimony said, like, all the calls could go to him and he would route them to the right person, but if there's a better way to do it, then just gives them an opportunity. If they're like, wow, this car's only 6 months old, is this really a fail? Give them that opportunity to ask
It's
somebody.
like the shock example that was given in testimony.
So yeah, it doesn't have to be about rotors, it could be about anything.
I've got a meeting.
Yeah. Okay, so we will, thank you, Anthea.
Oh, what? Huh?
Oh,
Oh, is that your baby?
This is the middle one,
The middle?
The middleist.
the middleist.
Oh,
Yeah. So this is Adrian.
Hi,
He's
Adrian.
having lunch next to me.
and, does he have a fever?
Yes.
Oh, oh.
what a cutie. Okay,
Okay.
Well, let's get back.
bye. See you tomorrow.
See you tomorrow.